He only stopped to rest, nothing more, just a man on a long drive pulling over for a moment of peace. But in an instant, flashing lights shattered the calm. Accusations flew, hands grabbed, and before he could even explain, he was in handcuffs, treated as guilty for the color of his skin. The humiliation was sharp, the injustice undeniable. Yet what those officers didn't know was that their actions would come back to haunt them in the most unexpected courtroom of all. What happens when power flips overnight? Marcus had always believed in the power of justice. For over 2 decades, he had carried himself with dignity inside the courtroom, where his voice could shape the course of lives and his decisions echoed far beyond the walls of the courthouse. To his colleagues, he was a man of principle. To his community, a figure of inspiration who had risen from humble beginnings to sit in one of the most respected chairs in the legal system. Yet outside those polished walls, in the anonymity of everyday life, he was simply Marcus, a man who enjoyed long drives, quiet reflection, and the rare chance to step away from the weight of his robe. That day, he was on the road, heading back from a legal seminar that had left him both tired and thoughtful. He pulled into a rest stop tucked along the highway, the kind of place most travelers forget as soon as they leave it. It was nothing more than a row of vending machines, a few benches, and a restroom under flickering fluorescent lights. But for Marcus, it was a welcome pause. He stretched his legs, bought a bottle of water, and sat for a moment in the warmth of the fading sun. For once, there were no court filings, no case arguments, no stern faces awaiting his verdict, just a man catching his breath. He didn't notice at first, but he wasn't entirely alone. A police cruiser sat idling a few spaces away, its engine humming steadily. 2 officers inside were watching. Marcus didn't recognize their stares. He had felt such looks before, in different forms, throughout his life. They weren't glances of curiosity, but of suspicion. To them, he wasn't a judge or a man resting on a long drive. He was just another black man in a place they didn't think he belonged. And within moments, that ordinary stop would turn into a confrontation Marcus would never forget. Marcus rose from the bench, twisting the cap off his water bottle, ready to continue the drive home. That was when he noticed movement from the corner of his eye. The cruiser door swung open, and 2 officers stepped out. Their boots hit the pavement in sharp rhythm, the kind of sound that instantly changed the air. The rest stop felt suddenly smaller, colder, as though it had been stripped of its quiet anonymity. "Sir," one of them called out sharply, their tone more command than greeting. Marcus turned slowly, the bottle still in his hand. The officer's eyes swept over him, not seeing the well-dressed man, not the distinguished face that had been featured in newspapers for his rulings, not the individual. They saw only what they wanted to see, a black man lingering in a place they didn't think he belonged. "What are you doing here?" The taller officer pressed, his hand resting casually on his belt near his holster. Marcus's pulse quickened. It wasn't the words that struck him, it was the weight behind them. He explained calmly that he was just taking a short break during a long drive, but his voice seemed to carry no meaning. They exchanged glances, skeptical, as though his presence alone was justification enough for suspicion. "ID," the other officer demanded. It wasn't a question. Marcus hesitated for a fraction of a second, and that pause seemed to confirm something in their minds. Their posture stiffened, their voices sharpened. In the space of seconds, a routine stop had transformed into a stage of intimidation. He reached for his wallet, slow and deliberate, aware of how every motion might be perceived. But before he could even hand over his license, one officer grabbed his wrist, twisting it with unnecessary force, while the other yanked the bottle from his hand as if it were a weapon. Marcus stumbled, his body pressed hard against the hood of the cruiser. The metal burned hot from the day's sun, branding his cheek with humiliation. Anger surged, but he swallowed it. He knew too well how fragile the moment was, how quickly a story like his could end in tragedy. He wanted to shout his identity, to tell them who he was, what authority he held. But he also knew titles and achievements rarely mattered in moments like this. To them, he wasn't Marcus the judge. He was just another black man they had decided to control. Other travelers had begun to notice. A family walked briskly past, eyes averted, pretending not to see. A trucker paused near the vending machine, his hand frozen on the keypad, torn between watching and escaping. No one spoke. No one intervened. Silence hung heavier than the officer's grip. Resisting, one of them muttered, as if laying the groundwork for a report that hadn't yet been written. Marcus froze, his muscles tight, realizing how dangerous even the smallest movement could be. His career had taught him about legal framing, how narratives were constructed to protect the powerful. And here he was, caught inside one being written against him in real time. They shoved him into the back of the cruiser, the door slamming shut behind him. The interior smelled of old sweat and stale fast food wrappers. He sat there, hands trembling, not from guilt, but from rage and disbelief. This wasn't happening to a stranger. It wasn't a headline in tomorrow's paper. It was happening to him, a man who had dedicated his life to upholding justice, now shackled by the very system he had served. The drive to the station blurred into a haze of flashing lights and silent fury. Every second stretched, the weight of humiliation pressing harder. He thought of his courtroom, the polished wood, the authority of the gavel. Would those officers ever imagine the man they had pinned to the hood of their car was the same man who could decide their fate with a single ruling? For now, though, they held the power. At least, that's what they believed. What they didn't know was that tomorrow, when they walked into court, their world would turn upside down. The cell door clanged shut behind Marcus, its metallic echo slicing through the silence of the holding area. He sat on the cold bench, the smell of bleach and despair heavy in the air. Hours dragged on, every tick of the clock drilling the humiliation deeper into his bones. He replayed the moment over and over, the wrist grabbed, the shove against the hood, the whispers of resisting. This wasn't just an arrest. It was an erasure. At one point, an officer passed the bars, smirking as if Marcus's suffering was entertainment. He wanted to rise, to shout, to remind them who he was. But he stayed silent. Injustice had stripped him bare. But beneath the humiliation, a storm was gathering. They thought they'd broken him. In truth, they had awakened something far stronger. Morning arrived, pale sunlight cutting through the narrow window. The officers swaggered around, laughing, their confidence unshaken. To them, this was just another day, another arrest. They had no idea that the man they mocked would not remain in this position for long. When Marcus's release finally came, it was without apology, without explanation. Paperwork was shoved into his hands, his belongings returned carelessly. He walked out, shoulders heavy with shame but eyes burning with resolve. They saw only a man they had humiliated. What they didn't see was the robe, the bench, the authority waiting for him on the other side of that day. Hours later, the courtroom buzzed with tension as the two officers entered, confident and oblivious. Their case had moved quickly, the accusations of misconduct now under formal review. They straightened their uniforms, ready to defend their actions. But when the door at the front of the room opened and Marcus stepped in, clad in his black robe, the air shifted like a thunderclap. Their faces drained of color, eyes widening in disbelief. The man they had manhandled, mocked, and treated as less than human, now stood elevated above them, not as a victim, but as their judge. The gavel hit the block, sharp and commanding. The room fell silent. The same hands they had forced against the hood now commanded authority over their futures. In that instant, power flipped on its head. The officers shifted uncomfortably, the arrogance gone, replaced by a gnawing fear. Justice, for once, would not be written in their terms. And as Marcus looked down from the bench, the weight of what had happened was clear. This wasn't just his moment, it was a reckoning. Tomorrow, the world would hear what happened in this courtroom. The courtroom that day became more than just a space for legal proceedings, it became a mirror reflecting the deep cracks in society. The officers who had once laughed, who had once believed their badges placed them above accountability, now sat humbled before the very man they had tried to strip of dignity. Marcus, steady and composed, carried himself not with vengeance, but with the weight of responsibility. He knew this moment wasn't just about him. It was about every black man and woman who had been silenced, overlooked, or mistreated under the guise of authority. The hearing ended with the officers facing disciplinary action, their arrogance shattered, their certainty of impunity gone. But for Marcus, the true victory wasn't in their punishment. It was in the undeniable truth that had been laid bare. Racism hides in plain sight, and even those tasked with protecting the law can weaponize it against the very people they are sworn to serve. Walking out of the courtroom, Marcus carried more than the robe of a judge. He carried the voice of millions who had faced the same injustice but never had the power to answer back. For him, the scars of that night at the rest stop would never fully fade. But they had been transformed into something larger, something unshakable. This wasn't just one man's story. It was a warning, a reminder, a testament that injustice, when exposed, demands a response. Because if a judge in his own country could be dragged from his car and humiliated, what did that mean for those without a platform, without a title, without protection? And so the question lingers, heavy and unresolved: how many more lives must be broken before the system itself is forced to change?